In the shadowy corridors of 17th century Spanish palaces, where power and cruelty danced hand in hand, there lived a child whose very existence became a haunting paradox, a testament to humanity's capacity for both profound wonder and unspeakable horror. Her name was Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, yet history, with its penchant for simplification and sensationalism, would remember her by a far crueler appellation, La Monstrua, the monster. This is not a fantastical tale of supernatural creatures or mythical beasts lurking in the dark corners of the imagination, but something far more disturbing and chillingly real. The true story of how a society, blinded by ignorance and fueled by the insatiable appetite of royal whims, transformed a vulnerable child into a source of public entertainment, how medical incomprehension morphed into calculated cruelty, and how the relentless pursuit of royal amusement could irrevocably destroy an innocent life. Eugenia's story compels us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own biases and prejudices, forcing us to examine how we perceive and treat those who are different, how easily dignity can be sacrificed on the altar of power and spectacle, and how readily we participate, often unwittingly, in the dehumanization of others. Born into a world that was ill-equipped to understand her unique condition, Eugenia would become both a victim of circumstance and an unwitting symbol of the Spanish Habsburg court's darkest traditions, a living embodiment of its moral failings. Her brief life, tragically cut short at the age of 25, would be immortalized in two haunting portraits that have survived the relentless passage of time, standing as silent, unwavering witnesses to a cruelty that echoed across generations and continues to resonate even today. The year was 1674, and in the remote, isolated villages nestled within the rugged terrain of northern Spain, medical knowledge remained shrouded in a thick veil of superstition, folklore, and widespread ignorance. What we now recognize through the lens of modern science as Prader-Willi syndrome, a complex genetic disorder characterized by insatiable hunger, metabolic abnormalities, and rapid weight gain, was then perceived through a far more judgmental and unforgiving prism, either as divine punishment for some unknown transgression, a mark of inherent sinfulness, or as a miraculous, albeit unsettling oddity, a source of both fascination and fear. For little Eugenia, this meant her own body would become her prison, a constant source of torment and limitation, and her very difference would become her defining curse, setting her apart from the world and marking her as an outcast. But this story transcends the confines of one girl's individual suffering, soaring beyond the specifics of her unique plight. It unveils the systematic exploitation of the disabled and the different by one of Europe's most powerful monarchies, a blatant abuse of power that exposes a world where human beings were collected and curated like exotic animals in a royal menagerie, solely for the amusement and diversion of kings. Eugenia's life, however brief and painful, would illuminate the darkest, most morally compromised corners of Spanish royal culture, a world where cruelty masqueraded as scientific curiosity, where indifference was cloaked in the guise of patronage, and where a child's profound pain became the twisted pleasure of an entire court. The Spanish Empire of the 17th century stood as one of the most formidable and influential forces in the world, its vast territories stretching across continents, its coffers overflowing with riches extracted from its colonial holdings. Yet beneath its shimmering golden facade, the empire was plagued by internal decay, crippling superstition, and a morbid obsession with the grotesque, a fascination with the unusual and the aberrant that reflected a deep-seated anxiety about its own declining power. King Charles II, infamously known as El Hechizado or the Bewitched, ruled over this crumbling empire with an increasing sense of paranoia, his court mirroring his own physical and mental afflictions, the devastating consequence of generations of relentless royal inbreeding aimed at preserving the purity of the Habsburg bloodline. In this atmosphere of waning power and heightened paranoia, the Spanish nobility had cultivated a peculiar and unsettling fascination with what they euphemistically termed human curiosities. The royal courts of the 16th and 17th centuries actively sought out and deliberately collected individuals with striking physical differences, developmental disabilities, and unusual medical conditions, amassing veritable collections of human anomalies. These individuals were not viewed as individuals deserving of the same fundamental dignity, respect, and care afforded to others, but rather as living ornaments, grotesque trophies designed to enhance the perceived beauty, power, and normalcy of their aristocratic masters. The practice had deep and insidious roots in European court culture, where the principle of contrast reigned supreme, influencing aesthetics, fashion, and even social interactions. By surrounding themselves with those deemed ugly, monstrous, or otherwise imperfect, the nobility believed their own beauty, refinement, and inherent superiority would shine all the more brightly, creating a stark visual and social dichotomy. This wasn't merely a matter of casual entertainment or fleeting amusement. It was a calculated system of dehumanization, an intentional exercise in social engineering designed to reinforce existing social hierarchies and solidify royal power. These unfortunate individuals were officially designated as gente de placer, people of pleasure, a cruelly ironic title that belied their true purpose, or more brutally, sabandijas del palacio, vermin of the palace, a term that stripped them of their humanity and reduced them to the level of pests. They existed in a strange and precarious limbo, neither fully servants nor honored guests, neither entirely human nor completely inanimate objects. They were fed and housed, provided with the basic necessities of survival, but never fairly compensated for their forced participation in the court spectacles. They were paraded and celebrated for their unusual features, yet never truly respected or valued as individuals. Their sole purpose for being was to provide amusement and diversion for those who held absolute power over life and death. The Spanish court under Charles II was particularly notorious for this dehumanizing practice, surpassing even its contemporaries in its scale and its blatant exploitation of vulnerable individuals. Historical records meticulously document that Philip IV, Charles's predecessor, maintained a vast and disturbing collection of approximately 110 people with dwarfism alone within the royal household, a veritable army of little people whose lives were dedicated to the court's amusement. These individuals were expected to perform, to entertain, to endure constant scrutiny, and most importantly, to constantly remind the nobility of their own perceived superiority, their own good fortune in having been born into privilege and perceived physical perfection. It was into this depraved world of systematic exploitation, casual cruelty, and blatant disregard for human dignity that young Eugenia would be thrust, becoming perhaps the most tragic and enduring symbol of this dehumanizing practice. On a quiet Sunday morning in 1674 in the small, unremarkable village of Merindad de Montija, nestled in the remote province of Burgos, an extraordinary event unfolded within the hallowed and ancient walls of the local church, forever altering the fate of one innocent child. Antonia de la Bodega, heavily pregnant and dutifully attending Mass with her husband, Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, was suddenly overcome by the throes of labor during the service, her carefully planned delivery thrown into disarray. With no time to reach the safety and comfort of home or to summon the assistance of a midwife, she gave birth to her daughter right there on the cold stone floor of the church, surrounded by the stunned silence of the startled parishioners and the watchful gaze of the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of prayer and communal worship. The villagers, deeply superstitious and prone to interpreting ordinary events through the lens of divine intervention, took this highly unusual birth as a powerful sign from God, a celestial event imbued with profound meaning. Surely, they whispered amongst themselves, this child was destined for something extraordinary, something far beyond the ordinary lives they themselves led. They named her Eugenia, a name derived from the Greek word eugenes, meaning well-born or noble, perhaps harboring a collective hope that her unusual entrance into the world would somehow translate into a blessed and prosperous life. How tragically and profoundly wrong they would ultimately prove to be. The very circumstances of her birth, which initially seemed so miraculous, would later be twisted and distorted into evidence of her monstrous nature by those who sought to exploit her condition and justify their cruel treatment. In those early months, before the true nature of her condition became apparent, Eugenia appeared to be a perfectly normal, healthy baby, indistinguishable from any other infant in the village. Her appetite was remarkably strong, bordering on voracious, and she grew and developed at an accelerated rate, traits that were initially celebrated and admired by her family and the wider community. In an era when infant mortality was devastatingly high, claiming the lives of countless newborns and young children, a baby who ate well and gained weight rapidly was considered particularly blessed, a symbol of resilience and future prosperity. Furthermore, the prevailing medical and aesthetic standards of the time actually favored plumper children and women, viewing them as visible signs of robust health, exceptional fertility, and overall good fortune. But as the months gradually passed, Eugenia's growth became increasingly alarming, deviating drastically from the established norms and raising serious concerns among her family. By her first birthday, a mere 12 months after her dramatic birth in the village church, she weighed an astounding 55 pounds, nearly 3 times the weight of a normal 1-year-old child. Her parents, simple peasants with no formal education and no understanding of complex medical conditions, initially attributed this extraordinary growth to God's boundless abundance, viewing her accelerated development as a divine blessing. Their daughter was clearly special, they reasoned, chosen by God to receive an extraordinary constitution that would serve her well throughout her life. However, as Eugenia's weight continued to increase at an unprecedented and seemingly uncontrollable rate, the family's initial pride and celebratory optimism began to gradually transform into worry, then fear, and finally, a deep and pervasive sense of shame and social stigma. By the time she reached the tender age of 6, Eugenia weighed an astonishing 155 pounds, approaching the size of a full-grown adult woman. Her body had become grotesquely disproportioned, her face round and puffy, her movements labored, awkward, and increasingly difficult. The blessed child, once seen as a symbol of divine favor, had become, in the unforgiving eyes of her community, a living curse, a grotesque aberration of nature. What no one in 17th century Spain could possibly have understood was that Eugenia was suffering from Prader-Willi syndrome, a rare and complex genetic disorder that affects the hypothalamus, the small but critically important region of the brain that controls hunger, satiety, metabolism, and a wide range of other essential bodily functions. People with this condition experience constant, overwhelming, and insatiable hunger that can never be fully satisfied, a relentless biological imperative that dominates their every waking moment. They eat not out of gluttony or a lack of willpower, as was commonly believed at the time, but because their brains never receive the crucial signal that they are full, leaving them in a perpetual state of craving. It's a cruel and unforgiving biological trap that condemns its victims to a lifetime of constant struggle with their own bodies, a battle they are destined to lose without proper medical intervention. And the syndrome also affects muscle tone, growth patterns, and cognitive development, further complicating the lives of those affected. Though Eugenia appears to have retained her mental faculties relatively intact, demonstrating a level of intelligence and awareness that belied her physical condition, contemporary accounts describe her as possessing a surprisingly pleasant personality and a genuinely beautiful face despite her physical challenges, a combination of traits that further intrigued and confounded those who encountered her. But in an age when such disorders were routinely attributed to divine punishment for hidden sins, demonic possession, or moral failings, Eugenia found herself increasingly isolated, misunderstood, and ostracized by her community. As her condition relentlessly worsened, the neighbors who had once celebrated her unusual birth began to whisper behind her back, casting furtive glances and pointing accusing fingers. Children who had once played innocently with her in the village streets now ran away in fear and disgust, or cruelly laughed at her appearance, mocking her every move. The village that had initially seen her unusual birth as a miraculous event now viewed her relentless transformation as a terrifying curse, a harbinger of misfortune. Her parents, overwhelmed by a crushing sense of shame, unable to understand or explain their daughter's condition, began to hide her away from public view, keeping her confined to the increasingly cramped and isolating confines of their humble home. The family desperately sought help from local physicians, religious figures, and traditional healers, clinging to the faint hope that some remedy could be found to alleviate their daughter's suffering. But 17th century medicine, with its reliance on outdated theories, ineffective remedies, and superstitious practices, had no answers for Eugenia's complex condition. Doctors prescribed a variety of treatments, ranging from dangerously strict diets to painful bloodletting, fervent prayers, and foul-tasting potions made from dubious ingredients. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could stop her body's relentless and seemingly unstoppable expansion. Each failed remedy only deepened the family's despair and reinforced the community's unwavering conviction that something supernatural, something inherently evil, was at work in their midst. In their growing desperation, Jose and Antonia consulted traveling physicians peddling miracle cures, unscrupulous folk healers promising miraculous results, and stern-faced priests offering divine intervention in exchange for penance, spending what little money they possessed on increasingly bizarre and outlandish treatments. Some suggested that Eugenia was possessed by particularly voracious demons of gluttony, spirits that could only be exorcised through extreme measures. Others claimed she had been cursed by envious neighbors, targeted by witchcraft and dark magic. A few even whispered that she might be a changeling, a monstrous creature secretly left by fairies in place of their real daughter, a creature destined to bring misfortune to all who knew her. Each consultation brought new humiliation, increased social isolation, and absolutely no relief, driving the family deeper into poverty and despair. By 1680, when Eugenia was just 6 years old, her condition had become so extreme, her appearance so shockingly unusual, that word of the giant child began to spread far beyond the confines of their small, isolated village. Traveling merchants, itinerant pilgrims, and government officials carried tales of the extraordinary girl back to their home regions, embellishing the stories with each retelling. And eventually, these sensationalized accounts reached the eager ears of the royal court in Madrid. In an era when communication was slow, unreliable, and prone to exaggeration, the fact that news of Eugenia traveled over 200 miles to reach the king speaks volumes about just how shocking her appearance had become and how desperate the court was for new sources of entertainment. King Charles II, already known for his insatiable appetite for human curiosities, his morbid fascination with the unusual and the aberrant, was immediately intrigued by the reports of this remarkable child, envisioning her as a unique addition to his royal collection. His court was always hungry for new spectacles, new wonders to display at royal gatherings and foreign diplomatic events, constantly seeking out new ways to divert the attention of a restless and increasingly critical aristocracy. The king's advisors, eager to please their monarch and maintain their own positions of power, painted a vivid picture of Eugenia, not as a suffering child in need of compassionate care, but as a rare and priceless treasure, a unique specimen that could bring glory, wonder, and renewed prestige to the royal household. The summons arrived in the form of a royal decree, an undeniable command from the highest authority in the land that the Martinez family could not possibly refuse. Eugenia was to be brought to Madrid immediately, regardless of the personal cost or inconvenience, to join the court of His Catholic Majesty, where she would be displayed for the amusement and edification of the royal family and its guests. For her parents, this royal command was a mixed blessing, a source of both hope and profound dread. It offered a potential escape from the unrelenting cruelty of their village, a chance to shield their daughter from the constant ridicule and ostracization she endured, and the promise of better care and nourishment for their daughter in the opulent surroundings of the royal palace. But it also meant surrendering her to a world they could never hope to understand or influence, entrusting her fate to the whims of a capricious and potentially cruel monarch. The arduous journey from their remote village in Burgos to the bustling capital city of Madrid was an ordeal that would mark the definitive end of Eugenia's childhood and the beginning of her life as a living exhibition, a source of constant public scrutiny. Traveling over rough, unpaved roads in a specially reinforced cart designed to accommodate her considerable size, she endured the relentless stares, whispered insults, and pointing fingers of everyone she encountered along the way. Each stop became an impromptu public spectacle as word spread quickly through towns and villages that the monster child was passing through, attracting curious onlookers eager to catch a glimpse of the unusual spectacle. When Eugenia finally arrived at the Royal Alcazar in Madrid, after weeks of grueling travel, she entered a world unlike anything she could have possibly imagined, a realm of unimaginable opulence and privilege. The opulent palace, with its endless corridors, shimmering golden furnishings, and army of impeccably dressed servants, must have seemed like a fantastical fairy tale to a young girl who had spent her early years in a simple peasant dwelling, accustomed to the harsh realities of rural life. But this gilded cage, with its superficial beauty and inherent constraints, would ultimately prove to be more prison than palace, a place where her humanity would be slowly and systematically stripped away in favor of her perceived value as a source of royal entertainment. The terrified 6-year-old Eugenia was immediately presented to King Charles II, who was reportedly delighted and intrigued by her unusual appearance. Contemporary accounts, tinged with a mixture of fascination and condescension, describe how the king himself bestowed upon her the infamous nickname that would follow her for the rest of her tragically short life, La Monstrua, the monster. This was not said with overt malice or intentional cruelty, but with the casual indifference of someone who had never learned to see disabled people as fully human beings, possessing the same inherent rights and dignity as anyone else. To Charles II, Eugenia was simply a fascinating acquisition, a rare and exotic addition to his collection of human curiosities, akin to a rare animal or a precious jewel, something to be displayed and admired for its unique and unusual qualities. The royal tailor, renowned for his skill and artistry, was immediately commissioned to create a series of special garments for Eugenia, transforming her from a simple peasant child into a courtly spectacle, a living work of art designed to capture the attention of the royal court. She was dressed in sumptuous gowns crafted from the finest materials, including shimmering red and white brocade, adorned with intricately designed silver buttons and delicate handmade lace that would have cost more than her family's entire annual income. These beautiful and elaborate clothes served a dual purpose. They made her already striking appearance even more visually arresting and unusual, while also clearly marking her as the property of the crown, a possession to be flaunted and displayed. Eugenia was assigned private quarters within the vast palace complex, a suite of rooms that reflected her ambiguous status as something between a pampered pet and a highly prized performer. Though her living conditions were far more luxurious than anything she had ever known, reflecting her perceived value to the court, she was, in effect, confined to her rooms, her movements restricted, and her interactions with the outside world carefully controlled. She was well-fed, provided with an abundance of food that far exceeded her needs. Indeed, her constant and insatiable hunger, a direct consequence of her Prader-Willi syndrome, was indulged to an extent that would have been utterly impossible for her peasant family to provide. The royal kitchens provided her with an endless supply of rich bread, succulent meats, decadent sweets, and exotic delicacies, treats that only worsened her underlying medical condition while simultaneously keeping her docile, dependent, and firmly under royal control. Her daily routine revolved entirely around her assigned role as a source of royal entertainment, her life carefully orchestrated to maximize her visual impact on the court and its guests. She was wheeled out for court gatherings, formal diplomatic receptions, and extravagant royal parties, events where nobles would openly marvel at her size and freely comment on her condition, discussing her as if she were an exotic animal on display in a zoo rather than a sentient human being with feelings and emotions. Ladies of the court, in particular, enjoyed being photographed and painted alongside her, as the stark contrast between their own slender figures and conventional beauty and Eugenia's unusual physique served to enhance their own sense of desirability and social standing. Eugenia had become a living prop in the elaborate theater of royal vanity, her existence reduced to a series of carefully staged performances designed to reinforce the power and privilege of the Spanish monarchy. The court physician, Dr. Juan Cabezudo, a man more interested in currying favor with the king than in providing compassionate medical care, even published a pamphlet about Eugenia in 1680, a sensationalized and highly biased account titled "True Account of the Prodigies of Nature That Have Arrived at This Court." In this document, he described her not as a suffering child in need of medical attention, but as a miracle of nature, a unique specimen sent by God for the express purpose of amazing and delighting the royal household. The pamphlet was widely distributed throughout Spain and beyond, turning Eugenia into a celebrity of sorts, albeit one defined entirely by her physical condition rather than by her personality, her intelligence, or her inherent humanity. But perhaps the most profound and enduring violation of Eugenia's dignity came through the artistic legacy that would forever immortalize her suffering, ensuring that her story would be remembered for centuries to come. King Charles II, utterly fascinated by his latest acquisition, commissioned the highly esteemed court painter Juan Carrillo de Miranda to create portraits of La Monstrua, capturing her likeness for posterity. Carrillo, already established as one of Spain's most skilled and sought-after portraitists, was instructed to depict Eugenia in two strikingly different states. Fully clothed in her elaborate royal finery, a symbol of her elevated status at court, and completely nude, a stark and unsettling depiction of her physical condition. The resulting paintings, completed around 1680, are among the most disturbing, thought-provoking, and morally complex works in Spanish art history, raising profound questions about representation, exploitation, and the ethics of artistic creation. Titled La Monstrua Vestida, the monster clothed, and La Monstrua Desnuda, the monster nude, these portraits have survived for over 3 centuries, standing as silent and unyielding witnesses to the cruelty, exploitation, and profound dehumanization that defined Eugenia's existence at court. In the clothed portrait, Eugenia appears dressed in her elaborate red and white gown, her small hands delicately positioned in a pose that might have been appropriate for any noble child of the era, carefully mirroring the conventions of royal portraiture. But her expression, captured with brutal honesty and unsettling accuracy by Carrillo, tells a far different and more heart-wrenching story. Her eyes, the windows to her soul, reflect a profound and unsettling sadness, a weary resignation that should never be seen in the face of a child. She appears to understand on some level that she is being displayed rather than honored, used rather than celebrated, reduced to a mere object of curiosity. The nude portrait is even more disturbing and ethically problematic, as it strips away not only Eugenia's clothing, but also any pretense of treating her with dignity or respect. Posed like a classical figure, her body arranged in a manner reminiscent of ancient sculptures, she holds a bunch of grapes in her hand, a subtle yet powerful reference to Bacchus, the Roman god of wine, revelry, and excess. This artistic choice transforms her from a suffering child into a mythological creature, further dehumanizing her condition by suggesting that her obesity represents a personal indulgence rather than the manifestation of a complex and poorly understood medical illness. Art historians have debated these paintings for centuries, grappling with the ethical implications of their creation and their enduring legacy. Some argue that Carrillo painted Eugenia with remarkable sensitivity and surprising dignity, managing to capture her humanity despite the inherently exploitative circumstances under which the portraits were commissioned. Others contend that the very existence of these paintings, particularly the nude, represents one of the most blatant and morally reprehensible acts of exploitation in art history, a stark example of how artistic representation can be used to perpetuate and reinforce social inequalities. The truth likely lies somewhere between these two extremes. Carrillo was undoubtedly a skilled artist, working within the constraints of a royal commission, trying to balance the demands of honest portrayal with the expectations of his powerful patron, King Charles II. What cannot be debated or denied is the profound and lasting impact these paintings had on Eugenia's life and legacy, forever shaping how she would be remembered by future generations. They turned her into an object of artistic study, a subject to be analyzed, dissected, and discussed by countless people who would never know her as a person, reducing her entire existence to a set of brushstrokes on a canvas. The paintings traveled throughout Europe, carrying her image to foreign courts and aristocratic salons, where she became synonymous with Spanish royal excess, cruelty, and a callous disregard for human dignity. Long after her death, these portraits would ensure that she was remembered not as Eugenia, the child with a complex medical condition, but as La Monstrua, the monster, a grotesque figure forever frozen in time. Life at the Spanish court during the reign of Charles II was a constant and carefully choreographed performance of power, vanity, and casual cruelty, a daily spectacle designed to reinforce the social hierarchy and maintain the illusion of royal authority. And Eugenia found herself trapped at the very center of this theatrical world, her existence reduced to a series of carefully staged appearances. Her days followed a rigid and predictable routine, designed entirely around the entertainment needs of the nobility and the whims of the king. Each morning, she would be meticulously dressed by servants in one of her elaborate gowns, her hair painstakingly arranged, and her face painted with cosmetics to maximize the visual impact of her unusual condition when presented to visitors. The palace courtiers developed a particular and deeply unsettling fascination with using Eugenia as a measuring stick for their own beauty, refinement, and moral virtue, creating a constant and demeaning comparison. Noble ladies would specifically request to be painted or photographed alongside her, fully aware that the stark contrast between their own carefully cultivated appearances and Eugenia's altered form would make them appear more delicate, desirable, and inherently superior. These sessions were not private affairs, but rather public spectacles, with crowds of nobles gathering to openly comment on the stark differences between conventional beauty and Eugenia's physical appearance, dissecting her every feature with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Diplomatic visits intended to foster goodwill and strengthen international relations provided some of the most humiliating and dehumanizing experiences for Eugenia, as foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries were invariably presented with the court's collection of human curiosities as part of the standard entertainment program. She would be wheeled into ornate reception halls like a piece of furniture, expected to remain silent and still while visitors openly examined her, discussed her condition with a shocking lack of sensitivity, and marveled at her size and unusual proportions. These encounters reduced her to the status of a museum exhibit, a display of royal power and control, valuable only for what she represented rather than who she was as an individual. The psychological toll of this existence can only be imagined, but it must have been immense and deeply damaging. Contemporary accounts, filtered through the biases and prejudices of the time, suggest that Eugenia retained her mental faculties and was generally described as having a pleasant personality despite her circumstances. Some courtiers even noted that she seemed to genuinely enjoy the attention and the fine food provided by her royal patrons, interpreting her apparent contentment as a sign of her simple-mindedness. However, these observations come from people who had never considered her perspective or emotional well-being, viewing her through the lens of their own assumptions about what someone in her position should feel, failing to recognize the complex emotions that lay hidden beneath the surface. The few fleeting glimpses we have of Eugenia's inner life come through careful and critical examination of Carreau's portraits, particularly the profound sadness and weariness that are visible in her eyes. Modern psychological analysis of these paintings suggests that she was a child who understood her situation far better than her handlers realized, acutely aware of the exploitative nature of her existence. The weight of constant observation, the knowledge that her value lay entirely in her difference, and the profound isolation from normal childhood experiences all contributed to what must have been a profoundly lonely and emotionally damaging existence, despite being constantly surrounded by people. The court's treatment of Eugenia reflected broader attitudes toward disability, difference, and social marginalization in 17th century Europe, attitudes that were deeply rooted in ignorance, superstition, and widespread prejudice. Medical understanding of genetic conditions was virtually non-existent, and physical abnormalities were typically interpreted through religious or supernatural frameworks, viewed as either divine punishment, demonic influence, or simply inexplicable aberrations of nature. The scientific concept of Prader-Willi syndrome wouldn't be identified or understood until the mid-20th century, meaning that Eugenia's condition was seen as either a manifestation of God's wrath, the work of evil spirits, or simply an inexplicable and unsettling curiosity of nature, a source of both fascination and fear. This pervasive ignorance had profound and devastating implications for how Eugenia was treated throughout her life. Rather than receiving appropriate medical care aimed at managing her condition and improving her quality of life, she was instead indulged in ways that actively worsened her health, contributing to her physical decline. The royal kitchens provided her with unlimited access to rich foods, sugary sweets, and decadent delicacies that would have been utterly impossible for her peasant family to afford, a seemingly generous gesture that ultimately did far more harm than good. While this was perceived as a sign of royal generosity and benevolent patronage, it actually accelerated her weight gain, exacerbated her underlying medical condition, and contributed to her premature death. The court physicians who examined Eugenia were more interested in documenting her unusual condition and publishing sensationalized accounts of her case than in providing compassionate and effective medical treatment. Dr. Juan Cabazudo, who published the infamous pamphlet about her, approached her case from a perspective of detached curiosity rather than genuine medical concern, treating her as a scientific specimen rather than a human being in need of help. His writings describe her measurements, her appetite, and her behavior in meticulous and clinical detail, but show no evidence of any attempt to understand the underlying cause of her condition or to develop treatments that might alleviate her suffering and improve her overall quality of life. This medical neglect was compounded by the profound social isolation that came with her assigned role as court entertainment. While surrounded by people at all times, Eugenia had no real relationships or genuine human connections, existing in a state of perpetual loneliness. She was not provided with an education like other children, not given opportunities to develop meaningful friendships, and not prepared for any kind of independent life, her future entirely dependent on the continued favor of the royal court. Her existence was predicated on royal amusement, her value defined solely by her physical condition, making her vulnerable and utterly dependent on the goodwill of others. The psychological impact of this treatment would have been devastating for any child, but it was particularly damaging for one dealing with the additional challenges of Prader-Willi syndrome. People with this condition often struggle with a range of behavioral issues related to their constant hunger, their frustration with their inability to control their eating, and the social stigma they face as a result of their condition. In an environment where her overeating was actively encouraged rather than carefully managed, and where her emotional needs were completely ignored or dismissed, Eugenia faced an almost impossible psychological burden, trapped in a cycle of dependence, exploitation, and profound loneliness. As the years slowly passed, Eugenia's role at court began to evolve in subtle but significant ways, reflecting the changing dynamics of the royal household and the shifting whims of the king. Initially brought to Madrid as a 6-year-old curiosity, a novelty to be displayed and discussed, she gradually became a permanent fixture of royal entertainment, her presence so consistently expected that foreign visitors specifically requested to see La Monstrua during their diplomatic visits, adding her name to their itineraries. This increased familiarity, born of constant exposure and repeated interaction, gradually bred a kind of casual affection among some of the courtiers, who began to view her less as a mere spectacle and more as a beloved, if somewhat unusual, member of the palace household. However, this evolution was a double-edged sword, a mixed blessing that brought both benefits and unintended consequences. While some nobles developed a genuine fondness for Eugenia, treating her with kindness, ensuring her comfort, and occasionally engaging her in conversation, this affection was still fundamentally rooted in her assigned role as entertainment rather than in a true recognition of her full humanity. She became something akin to a cherished pet, loved for her uniqueness, her loyalty, and her enduring presence, but never truly seen as an equal or independent being with her own desires, aspirations, and inherent worth. The court's treatment of Eugenia also reflected the broader and more complex dynamics of Spanish royal culture during this tumultuous period in history. King Charles II himself was physically and mentally disabled due to generations of royal inbreeding, a fact that created a paradoxical situation within the court where disability and difference were simultaneously stigmatized and normalized, both feared and subtly embraced. The king's own limitations and personal challenges likely made him more tolerant of others with physical challenges, but also more likely to view them through the lens of his own experience of being valued, despite, rather than for, his personal qualities, creating a complex and often contradictory dynamic. Palace records from this period, sparse and incomplete as they are, suggest that Eugenia developed particular relationships with certain members of the royal household, forming bonds that provided her with some measure of comfort and companionship. Some accounts mention her fondness for specific courtiers who showed her kindness and attentiveness, offering her small gifts and engaging her in conversation, while others describe her apparent pleasure in certain court activities like musical performances, religious ceremonies, and festive celebrations. These fleeting glimpses of personal preference and emotional response hint at a rich and complex inner life that was largely ignored or dismissed by those around her, reduced to superficial observations rather than genuine attempts at understanding. But as Eugenia entered her teenage years, a period of profound physical and emotional change for any young person, new challenges emerged, further complicating her already difficult existence. Her continued and largely unchecked weight gain made movement increasingly difficult, limiting her mobility and hindering her ability to participate in court activities. Her overall health began to show worrying signs of deterioration as the cumulative effects of her condition began to take their toll on her body. The constant strain on her heart, joints, and other vital organs, consequences of Prader-Willi syndrome that were completely unknown to 17th century medicine, began to manifest in a range of troubling symptoms that were largely ignored or dismissed by the court physicians. What had once been seen as an amusing and wondrous miracle of nature was now rapidly transforming into a medical tragedy that the court was utterly unprepared, both medically and emotionally, to address. By the 1690s, as Eugenia entered her 20s, the novelty of her presence at court had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of weariness and indifference. New curiosities and entertainments captured the fleeting attention of the royal household, and the woman who had once been the center of palace spectacles, the subject of countless conversations and artistic representations, found herself increasingly relegated to the margins of court life, her presence less valued and her contributions largely forgotten. The very condition that had made her valuable and desirable as a child was now making her a burden as an adult. Her deteriorating health problems and severely limited mobility, significantly reducing her entertainment value to the court. The conspicuous lack of contemporary records about Eugenia's final years speaks volumes about how her status at court had diminished, reflecting a profound shift in how she was perceived and valued. Where once every aspect of her condition was meticulously documented and widely discussed, her meals, her clothing, her interactions with the court, the last decade of her life passed with little official notice, her existence largely ignored by the historical record. She continued to reside within the palace, receiving food and basic care, but the constant attention, the intense scrutiny, and the insatiable fascination that had defined her existence since childhood had largely evaporated, leaving her isolated and largely forgotten. This neglect was particularly cruel and inhumane, given that Eugenia would have been experiencing the full and devastating impact of her underlying medical condition during these final years of her life, grappling with a range of debilitating symptoms. Prader-Willi syndrome typically leads to a range of serious health complications in early adulthood, including diabetes, heart problems, respiratory issues, and severe joint deterioration, all of which would have significantly impacted her quality of life. Without proper medical care, without a compassionate understanding of her condition, and without any meaningful social support, Eugenia faced these immense challenges essentially alone, her suffering largely invisible to a court that had lost interest in her story, focusing its attention on new diversions. The few surviving accounts from this period, often gleaned from fragmented letters and scattered diary entries, suggest that Eugenia somehow managed to maintain her pleasant and agreeable demeanor despite her declining health, her reduced circumstances, and the pervasive sense of neglect. Some courtiers noted her continued presence at religious services, her quiet participation in court celebrations, and her apparent contentment with simple pleasures like listening to music and eating her favorite foods. However, these observations come from people who had never been properly equipped to understand the complex emotional and physical needs of someone in her situation, lacking the medical knowledge, the social awareness, and the basic human empathy necessary to truly comprehend her suffering. Perhaps most tragically, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that anyone at court ever considered what Eugenia might actually want for her own life or her own future, never offering her the opportunity to express her own desires or pursue her own aspirations. She had spent nearly 2 decades as a royal possession, a source of entertainment for the powerful and privileged, valued solely for her difference, but never consulted about her own wishes, her own hopes, or her own dreams. As her health declined, as her entertainment value diminished, and as her presence became less desirable to the court, she faced the prospect of an uncertain future, with no skills, no education, and no social support system beyond the increasingly indifferent royal household, making her future precarious and uncertain. The exact circumstances surrounding Eugenia's death remain shrouded in the same casual indifference and historical neglect that marked her final years at court, a reflection of how thoroughly her value as a person had diminished once her entertainment worth expired. Historical records suggest that she died around 1699 at approximately 25 years of age, but the specific cause of her death was either not recorded or has been irretrievably lost to time, erased from the historical record as if her life had never mattered. This glaring lack of documentation stands in stark contrast to the detailed accounts of her arrival at court, her early years as a royal curiosity, and the artistic representations that immortalized her likeness, highlighting how completely her value as a person had been devalued, how easily she was forgotten once she ceased to be useful to the court. What we do know about her death comes primarily from cold and impersonal palace inventory records that noted the return of her clothing and personal effects to royal storage, a bureaucratic process that stripped her of any remaining vestige of dignity. These documents list her elaborate gowns, so the story of Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, La Monstrua, isn't just a historical anecdote. It's a stark reminder of our shared responsibility to see the humanity in everyone, regardless of their differences. It challenges us to confront our own prejudices and to actively dismantle the systems that allow for the exploitation and dehumanization of vulnerable individuals. Eugenia's life, though tragically short and defined by cruelty, serves as a powerful call to action, to cultivate empathy, to champion inclusivity, and to fight for a world where every person is valued and respected for who they are, not for how they appear. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What resonated with you the most? What questions did it raise? Please share your comments and start a conversation below. And if you found this exploration into Eugenia's life thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe. That way, you won't miss out on future deep dives into history and examinations of the human condition. Thanks for watching.